So by way of introduction, I'm Jeff Adams. I'm the Director of Accessibility Operations for UsableNet, and I'm your host for today. I've been with UsableNet for a decade now, and I've worked with hundreds of our clients on their website accessibility journeys, in particular around inserting accessibility into their software development lifecycle so they can shift left the responsibilities and activities around accessibility. Luca.
Yeah, hello everyone. My name is Luca Boškin and I am a designer at UsableNet. Along with other developers and engineers, I'm part of our core team, which is responsible for the development of our platform and tools for supporting and evaluating sites accessibility. And I also work with many different clients as a design consultant for accessibility and usability.
Great. And for UsableNet has been working in accessibility for 20 years now, working across a wide variety of industries, including retail, travel, and hospitality, to name a few. We're also partnered with leading disability community organizations, such as the American Federation for the Blind, Access Work, and Helen Keller Services for the Blind. And now I'm going to turn this over to Luca to discuss accessibility design for e-commerce.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. So first of all, let's have a look at today's agenda. So first of all, I will walk you through the relationship of accessibility and usability. And we'll try here to give a definition for both of those two terms. So what accessibility and usability actually mean. And then we'll try to discuss and analyze the 4 types of disabilities and the design challenges that each one of those disabilities present in terms of making our websites more usable and accessible. Then during the main part of today's webinar, we'll have 2 design highlights. The first one will be on navigation and the second one will be on interactive design. And both of those 2 sections will, I'll be showing you some real examples from e-commerce sites. And at the end, we'll try to wrap up all the discussed topic with some main takeaways. So let's get started. Let's discuss, first of all, accessibility and usability. So what does the term accessibility actually mean? So in the web context, accessibility aims at making sure our interfaces and technology works for people with clinically recognized disabilities. So to simplify even further, accessibility is about making sure our users or user groups using a different interaction channel can access to the same interface or use the same information as we do. For example, think about blind users. Blind user using a screen reader will get an auditory representation of the visual, let's say, visual interface. When it comes to usability, instead, to quote Jacob Nielsen, usability is a question of can people learn the interface? Can they understand it? Can they operate it efficiently? So in a way, you can see accessibility as one of the many parameters for measuring the overall usability of your product or your website. If you think about it, you can have a completely accessible website from the coding and technical point of view, which can, however, still lack a high level of usability because maybe it addresses the wrong user needs and expectations. Maybe it's too hard to use, and therefore, maybe users will not be able to use all of its features. But let's have a look at some really basic, really simple example of accessible design. Here we have curb cuts, for example. Curb cuts, the first appearance is dated around the 30s or 40s, but they were initially designed specifically for wheelchair riders, but it became immediately clear they were an essential object of urban design for people pushing strollers or shopping carts, deliverymen, elderly people using walkers or crutches, and of course, bicycle riders. So they became so popular. We now talk about the curb cut effect, which means that when a fix designed for a particular disadvantaged group of people ends up having very helpful ramifications for a huge group of people. And as a second example, what about the web context? So think about responsive websites. Responsive web design as a process is actually a great example of accessible design. Responsive web design has actually revolutionized the way we design for the web. It has made websites not just more future-friendly, but has enormously improved the overall people experience on the web, addressing two important user needs and expectations. The first one is that, of course, people want to access to content any way they want it. And secondly, people want a seamless experience across all their devices. And so it's important to understand that these two user needs and expectations involves all types of user groups, including those who are affected by some kind of disability. So what does the term disability really mean? And I'm going to give you the main definition from the World Health Organization, which states that there are three dimensions of disability, which are impairments, activity limitations, and participation restrictions. So let's start with an impairment. An impairment is a problem in body function or structure, which may lead to an activity limitation, which is a difficulty encountered by an individual in executing a task or an action. And as a consequence of an activity limitation, someone may come across a participation restriction, which is a problem experienced by an individual in involvement in life situations. So basically, there are four main areas of disabilities that affect our users on web, and those are visual, auditory, motor, and cognitive. However, most of the time, in the reality, users may be affected by a combination of different conditions that comes from these four categories. So I'll quickly walk you through every single one of these categories, starting with visual impairment. So, of course, a huge range of disabilities involves eyesight. Problems with eyesight aren't just related on the function of our eyes, but also how our brain perceives what we can see through our eyes. And all those conditions like nearsightedness, color blindness, or astigmatisms, of course, are very common in people of all ages. And from the design point of view, the main design consideration with visual impairments are the following. So for example, visual impairments, of course, affect everything we see on the web, and therefore users can benefit from more considerate text sizes, good typography, and well-structured layout. Also, the use of color is very important in terms of maintaining a good contrast of text and interactive elements. Then, of course, keyboard users, for example, strongly rely on the focus state of any interactive element. So, for example, throughout a whole purchase checkout process, the focus state of all the interactive elements and input fields and controls should always be clear and unambiguous. And finally, of course, changes on a page needs to provide not only visual feedback, but also an auditory feedback, for example, for blind users accessing to our websites. Then let's move on and talk about auditory impairment. So, of course, some people are born with hearing loss, while others lose their hearing through age, illness, or an accident. And we basically distinguish between conductive hearing loss, which is usually caused by a blockage or abnormality in the ear that prevents the sound from getting into the inner part of the ear, and sensory neural hearing loss, which is instead caused by damage to the nerves of the ear, so distorting sound and making speech harder to understand. Of course, many people with hearing loss use written and spoken language to communicate. So, for example, using email or messaging as a main tool for communication. However, think about sharing audio or video content. Those type of rich media, for those types of rich media, it's important to think about providing alternative ways to access this type of content, like transcripts or subtitles, for instance. Then let's move on to motor impairments. Of course, a broad range of conditions can cause motor impairments like cerebral palsy, neural tube defects, muscle and joint conditions, traumatic brain and spine injuries, and also physical labor and repetitive movements can lead to strain injury and other musculoskeletal disorders. From the design point of view, the main considerations here are the following. So first of all, keep your designs flexible. So don't bind your designs to exact coordinates and positioning, because they will break easily as soon as users start to adjust them using browser controls, like increasing the font size of the page or zooming into the page, things like that. And also support alternative ways of interaction mechanisms for the user interface. Like, for example, motor impairments can make the use of standard inputs and outputs pretty challenging. People, for example, may struggle to use a mouse, a keyboard, or a touchpad, depending on their physical condition and motor control of their arms, hands, or fingers. And so interactions that require a dragging interaction or a swipe gesture must always be supported with simpler alternatives, like a single tap interaction. Think about, I don't know, product carousels on PLPs or product image galleries. All those common components of online shops must always support alternative ways of interaction. And finally, let's quickly review cognitive impairments. Cognitive difficulties are incredibly diverse, and the issues that are particularly relevant on the web can be motory related, so difficulties remembering a task one is trying to accomplish. Then attention-related problem-solving issues, text processing issues, math processing, like difficulties understanding mathematical concepts and symbols, like distinguishing quantities, money, or pricing. And also visual processing difficulties, like interpreting visual information or visual representations of real-world objects, like pictograms or icons. And then among cognitive disabilities, we also include learning disabilities. And dyslexia is a general term for disorders that result in difficulty in learning to read or interpret words, letters, or other symbols. Then we have literacy. Literacy, or better, low literacy, is very common actually for users who may not have native familiarity with the default language of your website. So when it comes to cognitive difficulties, the main design recommendations here are, first of all, avoid cluttered layouts. So present only content that is relevant to your users and use a logical order and sequence for displaying it. Apply good typography and iconography, which means try to apply legible fonts and which are suitable for UI purposes, which don't include characters that could be confused by some users, and use highly recognizable icons. And finally, apply clear and simple language. So simplify your language in order to make it understandable and clear for the vast majority of users, and especially those who may be struggling with literacy. All right, so those were the four main categories of impairments that can affect our users on the web. And the same can actually be used also as parameters for measuring the level of usability and accessibility of every single aspect related to our website, like in this case, navigation. So when it comes to navigation, one of the fundamental aspects of usability and accessibility is actually making sure that our users and visitors find their way around the content when they land on our website. And when the navigation reflects the information architecture of your website, it gives people a better understanding of where they need to go, and also offers a preview of other information they may find relevant or interesting. And this is actually even more true when you land on a page like this one, which is probably not the most visited page of the Omega Watches website. But if you have a look at those two screenshots here, on the left, from the breadcrumbs trail, the page title and the section title, you can actually clearly see where you are. So the certificates and extracts page is a child page of the customer service section. And then if you scroll down and you reach the footer section of the page, the whole footer section actually contains the main links of the sitemap. So revealing the architecture of the site and offering an overview of all the other main content section a visitor may be interested in. Now, since we're talking about navigation, let's focus on site's main navigation. And actually, one of the most common design patterns that we see on modern websites is the use of a hidden navigation on mobile, which then turns into a visible top horizontal navigation or side vertical navigation as soon as there is enough layout room for displaying it. Of course, there are multiple variations to that patterns, but it's a pretty consolidated one. And I'm going to show you this example here from Canyon.com, which, for those who don't know, is a brand that sells bicycles exclusively online. And as you can see here, it starts with a hidden navigation on mobile, which then turns into a top visible horizontal navigation on desktop. And here is a screenshot of the expanded main navigation. As you can see here, it features a 3-level structure with the riding styles category on the top, like road, gravel, mountain, etc. Then you have the bike types subcategories like aero, endurance, race, etc. And at the lowest level, you have one or multiple product lines. This drill down structure supports the natural user behavior of scanning content vertically. So as you can see, users can see everything in a clear and organized way, and therefore can eventually make better navigation choices. But however, interestingly, only 1 year ago, the same website on a desktop view was featuring this type of hidden navigation pattern. So you can see that there was a menu button on the top left corner of the screen. And by selecting this menu button, I'm going to show you the recording now. Hidden navigation pattern, the panel will appear with the riding style categories organized vertically on the left, and on hover, all the subcategories would appear to the further right of the screen and organizing multiple columns. This navigation structure can, of course, apparently look very similar to the current one. However, from the visual design point of view, it actually has some significant downsides. The first one, and the main one probably, is that it is actually based on a horizontal sequence of information and options, which is pretty unnatural for users because we typically tend to scan content vertically. Also, furthermore, users with visual impairments or peripheral vision difficulties may have hard time following the horizontal sequence of content. And revealing content on hover may sometimes create problems to users with motor impairment, because it requires users to be very precise, for example, with the mouse cursor, in order to keep a specific subcategory always visible on the screen. And finally, from the implementation point of view, this type of menu structure is very complex to build, especially if you have to support keyboard navigation. So in general, this example from Canyon shows us that the use of a hidden navigation pattern can be both very useful and harmful at the same time, because of course, if the navigation is visible on the page, it means that it's constantly available, giving users not only quick access to the navigation, but also providing an overview of what the site has to offer. Alternatively, when the same navigation is hidden, it means that there is a higher interaction cost to get to the same information. So the user has to think about the navigation first, then locate it and expose it in order to see what are the navigation items placed inside of it. So the general recommendations around designing with the hidden navigation are the following. So try to avoid to use it at all. Also on mobile, if you have 5 or fewer navigation items to display. Avoid it on desktop navigation in favor of an always visible top horizontal navigation. And then, of course, on a mobile, there's always some sort of design trade-off to deal with. So if you find that the hidden navigation on mobile suits to your project, then make sure that is well supported with alternative ways of navigation, like in-page links, a visible search feature, and of course, a footer navigation, just to make sure that user don't rely exclusively on the hidden navigation, but have also alternative ways of available for navigating your site. And of course, when we talk about navigation, we are also looking at smaller page elements like titles and breadcrumbs. Both titles and breadcrumbs can be very useful for helping users find where they are within the site. Breadcrumbs are used to help visitors understand the relationship between the page they're viewing and other sections of the site. And they can be particularly useful to people who suffer from memory loss and confusion, who have maybe difficulty remembering where they've been or what they're trying to accomplish within the site. So we've just completed the highlight on navigation. So let's move now to the interaction design part. So when we talk about interactions and interaction design, things like changes in content, animations, following instructions, or filling in a web form, all these things may actually represent a burden or a challenge for people with learning difficulties and other cognitive impairments. So in general, interfaces should always help and assist the user understanding the content of the page. And when something goes wrong with an interaction, it should be always made easy for the user to fix that problem. And we'll start by talking about different types of carousels. Carousels actually have become pretty old-fashioned nowadays, especially on home pages. More often than ever are a sign of poorly structured content and more a result of compromises made between the marketing department and the design team. They're not useful on home pages because they essentially hide content that no one will see. And they also typically perform with a low conversion rate. And on this slide here, I will compare the current Zara.com carousel and the Tesco.com carousel. So let's start with Zara.com. Currently, Zara features an auto-advancing carousel with a vertical motion, which also features a manual horizontal navigation. So the user can navigate different product categories horizontally, like women, men, or kids. And then the auto-advancing motion will show different contents for these specific categories. The main problem from the accessibility point of view with this type of carousel is that, first of all, is not supporting any sort of controls for pausing and playing the motion of the slides, and is not built with a semantic structure. So is not providing a meaningful access to content, for example, screen reader users or keyboard users. The Tesco example on the right-hand side of the screen is instead a textbook example of an accessible carousel. So it's an auto-advancing carousel that pauses as soon as the user hovers over with the mouse cursor or focuses the whole component using keyboard navigation. And as you can see, it features visible controls for pausing and playing the motion of the slides. The next and previous buttons are clearly visible, and within the dot navigation element, also the selected and unselected states of the slides are distinguishable not only by color but also with borders. Then let's talk about audio and video content. So when it comes to using background videos, for example, the one you typically see on marketing landing pages, for example, keep in mind that any audio should always be muted by default, because you cannot predict which will be the user's context for accessing your websites. Like, for example, imagine someone in a quiet place, like a public library, or sitting next to a sleeping child. So leave the decision to the user to increase the sound volume of your website. Then for videos or even background videos that last for more than 5 seconds, you need to provide visible play and pause controls. And finally, Honor requests to remove animations and autoplay effects via the prefers reduce motion media query, which means that if a user sets at the device settings the request for having a reduced motion output for all the applications, including internet browsing, then also web pages should take into consideration this user request to basically provide a web page version with the reduced animation and let's say animated enhancements. Moving on, let's talk about maps or interactive infographics. So when it comes to more complex UI elements such as interactive maps, it's very common let's say it's very important actually to prioritize content, information, and messages in such a way that include as many user groups as possible. And when it comes to designing a store locator page like this one from coffeebean.com, you should ask yourselves, what are users supposed to take away from a map? And the basic solution here is to provide a textual alternative of the visual information displayed on the map. So in most of occasions, just showing the markers information as list items should work just fine. And again, as per this example here, the list view of options is beneficial not only for mobile users. In fact, for mobile users accessing to this page here, the default view will be the list view of the stores. But again, it's beneficial also for users accessing the desktop view using keyboard navigation or a screen reader. In fact, if you try to test the desktop view with keyboard navigation or a screen reader, you will notice that the whole visual part of the map is not even focusable or reachable, because it basically has been taken away from the accessibility tree in order to simplify and make the overall navigation for assistive software more meaningful and organized. Now let's talk about interacting with forms. When the page requires, for example, users to fill in a form, or during a purchase checkout process, it's important to always allow users to keep track of the information they have entered earlier. And this, of course, can help help people who need to refresh their memory or people with cognitive impairment. So as per this example here, as you can see, a user has reached the payment section of the checkout process. So the interface is requesting the user to fill in the credit card details, but still on the top, the same user can still maybe change the shipping method or change some contact details. And most importantly, also when it comes to designing a purchase checkout interface, it's very important to remember that the order summary should always be visible throughout all the different views of a purchase checkout flow. And since we were talking about forms, let's further talk about interaction with input fields. So other important aspects to consider with forms and input fields are the following. So first of all, form interactions should be assisting the user in filling out the fields easily and correctly. And they should also be forgiving enough to anticipate some typical user filling mistakes, like entering spaces on credit card fields when the input actually don't accept them. Then spelling, grammar checks, and auto-completion inside forms can be helpful for users with literacy, spelling, and language difficulties, and can also help making the overall filling experience faster for mobile users. Predictive text search forms can, of course, help people with dyslexia who may have trouble with spelling words correctly. And of course, asynchronous validation can provide a more immediate feedback to users about the input they have just filled. Then let's move on and talk about buttons. So buttons are probably the most prevalent interactive elements of our pages. Buttons can trigger a behavior such as submitting a form or changing a behavior within the same page. And like text links, of course, also buttons may have different states, like the default, active, hover, focus, or disabled. So while overwriting the default styles and creating new styles from scratch, designers have to make sure they don't lose some of this interactive style that visually describe a button state. So it's very important to design around every single state of any interactive element like buttons. And when it comes to screen reader users or even better, keyboard navigation users, it's very important to cover and design for the focus state, because the focus state, it's definitely the most important state of any interactive element. So make sure that the focus state is clearly visible and distinguishable. And how can we design an accessible focus state? Well, finally, this year, according to the W3C, it should be around July this year. There will be a new release of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which will be the 2.2. And finally, this brand new version of the WCAG will include a new success criterion, which is the 2.4.11 focus appearance, which finally provides clear requirements on how an accessible focus state should look like. So if you are about to start in a new design project or maybe reskinning your current website, it's worth checking it out to see how you can take these requirements into your project. All right, let's talk about now less common UI components, like in this case, a price range slider. So, of course, our visitors may use different human interface devices to access to our websites, like a mouse, of course, a keyboard, but also a touch display, a braille display, or a joystick. And designing inclusively means to support as many of these devices as possible and provide alternative content or interaction mechanisms where this is not actually possible. So let's have a look at this slider here. So this is taken from kayak.com. And basically, this slider represents an obstacle in at least two different user scenarios. The first one is, think of a user with motor impairment. So for people with motor impairment, it may represent an obstacle, this type of component, because it only requires the dragging interaction. So it's for a user with tremor, for example, it will be really challenging to be precise into selecting the desired price range, for example. The second scenario is related to mobile users. So as you can see here, the price range labels has been placed underneath the two sliding cursors. And again, this design choice is actually counterproductive for mobile users, because mobile users, while trying to interact with this type of component, will potentially cover those two values with their thumbs. So again, is not the disposition for the position for the minimum price and the maximum price values is not ideal in this case. I'm going to show you a much better example of the same component, which is instead taken from Airbnb. And as you can see here, Airbnb has found a solution to both support dragging interaction, but also a simpler input interaction. So by placing two numerical inputs on the bottom, Airbnb is immediately providing more freedom to users. So users can basically choose whatever works best for them in terms of providing or filling in the desired price range for a specific vacation stay. And finally, let's talk about providing feedback and alert messages. So when it comes to providing this, let's say, for example, when an alert or feedback message appears on a page without a page refresh, or when, for example, we are adding a new product to a shopping bag, visitors need to have their attention drawn to that change, not only visually, but also when they are accessing the page with a screen reader. And this consideration should make us consider the importance of how we write our feedback content and our content messages, because they can either fix a problem or further confuse and frustrate our users. So make sure that our written content and feedback messages are well written, appropriate, and useful. So let's try now to wrap up some main takeaways from this session. First of all, the importance of providing alternatives. So people with disabilities typically make up about 20% of the population at any given time. But we should never actually assume that people with impairments are using assistive technologies to access to our website. So it's important to provide alternatives that gives user freedom to choose whatever works best for them, instead of forcing them into one single direction, as we've seen with the price range slider example. Then try to involve code as early as possible. Of course, our interfaces are made of code, so working with code as soon as possible will help designers understand how the interface works under the hood, and will also help identify potential problems more quickly. And of course, maintaining a pattern library of coded solutions will also help your team build a strong collection of user interface components and solutions that are, of course, compliant and can also be used for further future project or purposes. Then embrace simplicity, which means the simpler an interface is, of course, the easier it is to be used by all kinds of users. And users will be also more willing to come back to your website to use your interface. Simple interfaces also require less code to make and are therefore also more performant. In terms of adopting an accessibility policy, well, when accessibility is instituted as a company-wide practice, rather than just merely observed by a few people within the team, it will be inevitably be more successful. So adopting an accessibility policy, it's important because it promotes the importance of accessibility within your company. It helps define approaches and procedures for maintaining accessibility, especially in the long term. And of course, ensures that people from all user groups will feel satisfied with your site's performance. And finally, train your team. Training, of course, is very important, especially for your organization, because it helps increasing the professional development of its employees. So, Jeff, I know you have a few words to add here in terms of the importance of training for teams.
Yes, thank you, Luca. In fact, this presentation is a great example of the accessibility training that UsableNet offers. And as Luca pointed out, accessibility is really something that everyone who works on a digital property plays a role in. And so it's important to make sure everybody across the teams and throughout the company are trained on accessibility appropriately so they understand it. A great example that he used right here at the end of in the last example actually was looking at those error messages and the states around that. Certainly the design team is going to create the user interface for how those appear and all the functionality around those elements, but it's the content team probably who is going to write the actual error text. So it's important for the design team to, in fact, or rather the content team, to understand how to create accessible content and what would be good, meaningful error text. Our trainings that we have here at UsableNet include ones that set the foundation understanding about the disabled community and how the web content accessibility guidelines are actually designed to improve websites for them, but then really by extension, improve usability for everyone who's using the site. And then once you've got that foundation in place across the company, then there are trainings that we have that specialize for designers, such as, this is a little bit of an excerpt of a training that Luca gives. We have trainings for content creators, for developers, for QA analysts, and really everybody who touches the digital properties. And that way, when everybody's trained and they understand the role that they play in accessibility, then it stays top of mind, really across the entire software development lifecycle as well. And I think with that, we are ready to take some questions. We do have some here in the Q&A panel. And as we mentioned earlier, keep putting these in. Even if we run out of time, we'll get back to you with answers next week because we are keeping logs of all of this. First one up for you, Luca, is in terms of the navigation being more effective drilling down rather than across horizontally, is this also the case for mobile? They see, the slide in pattern a lot in mobile with clear titles, and that usually seems pretty user friendly. What's your take on that?
Well, in a mobile context, this drill down structure is it's also a very consolidated one. The most important thing about making this three-level navigations on mobile is that, for example, the context is always repeated. So, for example, if you have on the first level of navigation something like I don't know, the main product categories, and they, by tapping a single category, a new panel slides to the left showing the sub items or subcategories for this specific category. It's important to keep organized the content. So put a heading on top of every single sub menu panel to help user identify in which section of the navigation there are. So don't give for granted that after tapping on the first top category, everything it's pretty straightforward for them on the second level or third level, but always make things obvious. So repeat in a sort of breadcrumbs fashion if you want, or using titles, but make sure that while drilling down the mobile navigation, the user can still understand in which section or level of the navigation they are in. And this also helps, of course, from the accessibility point of view. Users may be accessing the page using VoiceOver, and those who are maybe not tabbing through all the page content, but maybe navigating the page using headers. So again, the importance of placing a header on top of every single navigation panel is addressing exactly this problem. So it's making sure that a blind user, for example, can navigate the whole menu of the website using headings, for example, and not links.
Great. Hopefully that answered that question well. So the next one, I agree with your assessment on carousels. Do you have any alternative content layouts that you would suggest?
Well, I would say that, again, as I said during in the carousel section, there is, when it comes to deciding content prioritization on landing pages, for example, it's very important to, let's say, decide which is the most important content that actually serves as a purpose or it's meaningful for users on that, and design around that. Because most of the time, as I said, carousels are used to make everyone happy on a team, whether it's a design team or the marketing team or the executives, that anyone of that stakeholders wants a word on the overall, let's say, look and feel of the home pages. And that's why sometimes carousels get stuffed with a lot of slides that are not really useful at the end of the day. So designing meaningful pages and landing pages is getting straight to the point for the user to help them make a clear and transparent decision whether they want to purchase a specific product or not. So that's in my opinion should be the main let's say way of deciding how to which type of content should be used within a page. And in this case, of course, alternative ways of using of carousels could be just I don't know, static content sections, or I don't know, more alternative ways. As you can see, also a current, let's say, a current trend is to have a specific content section that announce a specific feature of a product, and then by clicking on a call to action, you get a modal dialogue window that explains further details on that feature or on that product. And that's a way of helping user drill down the information if they want to further understand how a specific feature works or how a specific product looks like.
And then actually another question on carousels, or in this case, sliders. Does the track and the handle need to meet the contrast requirements with each other and also against the background?
Yes. So you mean the handle, are you talking about scrolling stuff? Let me, can you point me towards the question, Jeff?
If you're in the Q&A panel, it's the second one in the panel right now.
Yeah. So when it comes to sliders, okay, yeah. So ideally the handles should meet the 3-2-1 minimum contrast being as, let's say, treated as a graphical object. And also the track ideally should meet the 3:1 minimum contrast, because the user should both need to be clearly see let's say the cursor of where that it's needed to perform the dragging interaction, but also the length of the overall component. So both the elements should meet the 3:1 minimum contrast.
When a button receives focus, it changes to its active state, but the focus outline is not displaying. Would this be okay, or should the button still have the focus outline visible along with the button state changing to active?
That's a pretty, I would say, so as a best recommendation here, I would say yes. So ideally, you cannot, also the focus, first of all, the focus states can behave slightly differently on different browsers. So ideally, the focus states should be, let's say, clearly visible at any time. Yeah, also when it becomes, also when the button becomes active because it's pressed, it should be in that specific let's say instant when the button is active, the active state will be triggered. So ideally, yes. The ideal question is yes.
Perfect. And I know we're running out of time. So as I mentioned, the questions that we don't get to here, we will definitely be following back up with everybody next week. I like this question a lot, so I'm actually going to hit it here because it definitely goes with the whole kind of shift left. Would you recommend testing product with diverse needs users early during the prototype stage or after a soft launch? Certainly, as I talk about, keeping things moving to the left to take care of these activities earlier, I would definitely say, test with prototypes, get feedback on mock-ups, get as much as you can as early as you can, so that you're not trying to take care of everything all at once towards the end when you're going to be pushed to make a product release anyway. And I would even say, get as much as you can before soft launch, but also test in that soft launch phase, and even again after you've released, to really make sure that you're taking accessibility into account at every stage. Would you add anything to that, Luca, or have?
Yeah, I would say that from the designer point of view, looking at people with disability interactive with your early prototypes or design composition can give you so much insight and so much quality for further product developments that you can even that you can imagine. So it's worth really investing in user testing with actual people or users with disabilities, because it also helps you basically create better product and better address the overall project development from start to launch at the end of the day, basically.
Let's see, trying to find it. Pick a great last question to cap us off with. I think we'll try this one out. What are your thoughts on using tab index equals 0 to force the focus on HTML elements like headers, spans, etc., so that they can be read out by a screen reader?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not really, let's say, a front-end developer. I kind of need to come back to that, because I'm not really, let's say, I'm not the best person to answer to that.
I picked the wrong question to end with.
Yeah,
is what
definitely.
It comes down to. I'm a little too technical on that one. Yeah, we'll definitely, as I said, get back to everybody on the questions that are in here. And if that,
it depends on which. I've seen that. I'm rereading the question right now from Juan. I will need a further, let's say, context for that. So, in which context do you mean that it's would you use this technique? Which type of problem is he trying to solve? In order to see if it's to let's say to evaluate if it's a good or bad practice.
Right, because certainly with headers and things like that, screen reader users have ways to navigate that separately from forcing a tab index on it. So, Juan, if you want to give us a little more context, we can also take that in to form more of an answer to that question. So with that, we are actually at time. Thank you everyone for joining us today. We hope you found this useful.